Good morning, everyone. My name is Tommy, and today I'm presenting an maze that I've designed inside a computer component called the motherboard. This maze is controlled by a central brain, the CPU, and has only one entry, and then countless outlets and ports for the graphic cards to show us visually what the computer is doing. The first space I'm showing inside the motherboard is the memory spaces. It's very organized. This is used as storage for the information and the traffic that the motherboard, that the CPU processes for later use. And the smaller components are connection between the base level of movement inside the circuit. The capacitors and the cooling and the inductors serve as a traffic control for the players inside the maze in case there's too much traffic at one place that overloads the CPU. These PCI slots are outlets and exit points from the maze, which is used for the graphic card and the video connectors to organize all this information by the CPU, and then shows us visually what our computer is doing and thinking. This is a model of the motherboard that I use in my own computer. This is a plan view of that motherboard. As you can see, the CPU is in the center. These black long strips are the exit points, and as well as the perimeter of the motherboard are covered by exit points. These smaller components and residencies can be seen as part of the machine city, a very base level of the city, where all the communication flows and the traffic continues in a very disorganized manner. But then these information from the smaller components are gathered and sent to the hubs, as you'll see in this map. It starts out from the power supply that powers a grid of smaller components, these residencies, and then they get sent to a bigger hubs, and then they get sent to the CPU. The CPU processes all the information and sends precise and fast demands and actions to the bigger hubs and then to the outlets on the very top of the diagram. So there are basically three levels of communication. The reason that I've chosen the motherboard as a site for the maze is this stifling system of control is very similar to the system of control that we see in most cyberpunk movies and video games. As you can see, when I zoom in, it resembles the plan of the machine city. These smaller residencies are exactly where they need to be, and then they gather the players, and then they send them to bigger hubs, and then eventually to the outlets that we see here. This space is more organized as a final stop before the CPU sends out the commands to all the other components and the outlets. These are temporary storage spaces for this information that the CPU processes and organizes. And as I dive deeper into the motherboard, I'm starting to imagine what is the experience of one traveling through the motherboard as small as an insect or an electron. I was beginning to imagine inside these plans and city of the motherboard and the maze, what would be the third-dimensional experience like. So on the very base level of the city and the maze is there's different layers and different players and information gets supplied and inputted in. And eventually, before the CPU processes them, they go into a bigger hub in this dome-like spaces. All these information becomes slightly more organized, and then that is ready for the next stop in this journey or maze is the memory spaces. Because the CPU processes these data and information, it becomes more organized and stored in a very long corridor of storage spaces in a very boxy and organized manner. Is a contrast of experience from what previously a flow and a flood of information on the base level of the motherboard and the city. As power flows into the motherboard, it powers CPU first. The CPU is a very dense little chip of processing units that has immense processing power, more than any other component on the motherboard. And as one enter through the wire, they would, this is what I imagine the information look like. The experience is like inside the CPU. The information is contained more, and then even though it's trying to escape and jump out of the box, the CPU controls them and tells them exactly where to go, which is forward. And then at the very end of the journey, after the CPU processes everything inside this loop of information, it becomes extremely three-dimensional in a three-dimensional matrix, an infinite matrix, where all the information are labeled, colored, and stored in extremely spatial and organized fashion. And that is for the final step, where one would leave the maze into the real world. It's curious to think that as one plays a player inside the maze as an electron, they will go through a series of amazing spaces, different experience from disorganized to organized, but eventually they become something more than just a signal or an electron. It becomes part of our real world. It becomes part of what we see on our computer screen, which is a different layer and world of views and information.